So it's Saturday, March 28th, 2020, and as we come to a close on the first 3 months of the new decade, I wanted to take a look back at the very eventful year it has been for the Democrat Party. The news cycle today is understandably dominated by coronavirus. I myself have been staying home for almost 2 weeks at this point, but before it took over the airwaves, the biggest news stories were impeachment and the Democratic primary. So, in December of 2019, House Democrats finally voted to pass articles of impeachment charging Donald J. Trump with abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. January of 2020, the beginning of the new decade. Nearly a month later, Nancy Pelosi finally delivered the charges to the Senate and actually begin the trial. Following that, it took about a month of Democrats and Republicans talking for 8 hours plus a day at each other for the case to finally come back with no conviction and not removing Trump. While impeachment might feel like a distant memory, it was only 2 months ago the Democrats started the year with a big L. As the news slowly began to pick up on the coronavirus in February, most of the coverage at the time still followed the Democrat primary. And then Andrew Yang was still in the race. But February was an interesting month for Democrats as it saw a number of problems. First primary is the Iowa caucus, and a series of unfortunate events for Bernie, or divine intervention for the DNC, led to a popular vote win for Bernie, but a delegate win for Buttigieg. Some of these events include the Des Moines Register, which is an influential paper in the state that had always released its polls for the Iowa caucus prior to the primary, canceled the poll one day before the caucus. People like to vote for winners, and so seeing a poll where one candidate may be surging ahead might actually be what it takes to give them the momentum to pull ahead. Additionally, the results actually took several days to come out, and they were released in such a way as to suggest that Bernie was not going to win in the end, although eventually he would win the popular vote. I would say this was probably the beginning of the end for Bernard Sanders. People like winners, so a positive result for Bernie in that poll would have seen him go ahead in Iowa. Win in Iowa, if reported in a timely manner, would only further his momentum in the direction. And additionally, Bernie Sanders won New Hampshire and Nevada in the following weeks. So there was clearly the potential to do a sweep, and that sweep possibly pushed him to the edge. But March 3rd, Super Tuesday, Joseph Biden took 10 out of 15 states and 60% of the delegates. Only days after this massive loss for Bernie, every other candidate aside from Tulsi Gabbard had dropped out and endorsed Biden, except for Warren, who dropped out and endorsed no one. As it currently stands, the elections are suspended and Biden has 41% of the delegates while Bernie has 31%. Point I want to emphasize in this video is the level of failure this campaign represents for Bernie Sanders as a person and for his political movement in general. As a person, Bernie Sanders, in my opinion, has always been a loser, and I don't say that to be mean. I don't mean it as an insult. I just mean it as somebody who isn't playing to win. He doesn't have the fire that it takes, the Mamba mentality to bring it home. And I have a few examples. After losing/tying with Buttigieg in Iowa, I remember watching Bernie do a CNN town hall where he was asked how he feels about the situation, and Bernie's response was essentially that he's satisfied with a tie. Now, again, that is not a winning mentality. Sure, he lost the delegates, but he won the popular vote, which is a huge sticking point for Democrats since Trump won in 2016. Hell, even Pete Buttigieg's platform featured removing the Electoral College. The fact that he didn't emphasize his popular vote victory and try to push ahead is just an example of that lack of winning spirit. The Des Moines Register spikes a poll, and the results are released in such a way that make him look bad. And again, he's still standing there and he takes it. Okay with the tie. When a member of Bernie's staff wrote an article criticizing Joe Biden's corruption, Bernie apologized. How does Bernie expect to win if he's unwilling to criticize the people he is up against? Bernie Sanders does not stand up for himself. That is a big problem when looking at somebody who's going to possibly be the president of the United States. In 2016, WikiLeaks demonstrated collusion between Clinton campaign, the DNC, and media organizations. And what does Bernie do after this happens? Endorse Hillary, who, by the way, spent a decent amount of 2020 bad-mouthing him. So he is, I think, a loser at heart. He doesn't have that winning mentality, and I think that has been demonstrated by this campaign failure. And while I think Bernie's personal failures are noteworthy, I think his movement's failures are the real star of this past year. Bernie could not win the primary, yet so many people still believes he would have a good chance of winning the presidency. I mean, there were head-to-head polls that put him beating Trump, and again, these are just predictions and polls, but the idea was if he got to that next level, he would actually be able to win. Now, just off the bat, 53% of Americans would not vote for a president who identifies as socialist. That is a big no-no for Americans. We are a capitalist nation. We don't like the idea of socialism. And look, I'm not going to argue that Bernie Sanders is a socialist or a communist, but he is a self-described democratic socialist. He does advocate for worker ownership of the means of productions in the form of 20% equity for workers. These are his platforms and his plans. So he does advocate for socialism. And as these things are often packaged together, Bernie also identifies with leftist identity politics and social justice. Social justice is a vague term that includes a lot of different groups, but I think feminism can be safely categorized within it, and probably one of the most prominent and popular types of social justice. Less than 30% females in the United States identify feminist, and presumably the number for men would be less, so you're talking about less than a third of the population that is interested in these social justice ideas. Anyone believes a democratic socialist feminist would win the presidency of the United States is beyond me. So I think it's pretty obvious how Bernie lost, but that's only part of the story. Sure, Bernie identifies with some kooky out-of-the-box ideas that are wildly unpopular, but hey, so does Trump, and he's the commander-in-chief. But that is thanks in large part to the historically awful candidate that was Hillary Clinton. So who did Bernie have to beat to win the Democratic Party nomination and take these kooky ideas to the next level? Joe Biden. While the race was dynamic throughout, with Biden dipping severely after poor performances in February, eventually it came down to Bernie or Biden. So, among the self-selected group of Democrat primary voters, a group that is by definition more politically left than average, Bernie still managed to lose. And not only does he manage to lose, but to Joe Biden, who is visibly senile. If people are in competition to be the most powerful person on the planet, and I do not know which is worse. Biden being mentally incapable of the position, yet still receiving the nomination, presumably, or Bernie Sanders losing the nomination to somebody who's mentally incapable, presumably. The silver lining I see for Bernie is that at least he's an independent. But Biden's eventual nomination is an indictment on Democrats. While I take comfort in knowing that Bernie Sanders' ideas are demonstrably unpopular and that his supporters represent a minority in this country, I find it incredibly disturbing that Democrat primary voters are so uninformed of Biden's mental state. Joe Biden is clearly not mentally well. He has trouble keeping his train of thought and speaking in public. Yet he is still the presumptive nominee for the most important office of the land for one of the two major parties in the most powerful nation in human existence. This is the best person that the Democrats could put forward. Not only that, there is ample footage of this man's mental decline, and yet nobody in the Democrat Party seems to be aware of it, or even acknowledging it. A large part of Biden's electoral success is people are familiar with him. People know him as Barack Obama's vice president. But there is ample footage available that shows his mental decline and that he's clearly not capable of the task ahead. Yet, people still voted for him because they are familiar with him. And that's because they're familiar with his name but know nothing about him, clearly. The media has failed to adequately cover this, and the voters have failed to adequately investigate this.